This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, it is a delightful honor to welcome Robert Levering and Stephen Talbot to this podcast. They are respectively the producer and the director of the documentary, The Movement and the Madman, about the Vietnam anti-war movement and Richard Nixon. Robert and Stephen, pleasure to have you here. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, let's start off by assessing the legacy of Richard Nixon's presidency, keeping in mind the Vietnam War as well as every other thing he did during that time.
Well, I'll just start briefly by saying our film focuses very specifically on one year, 1969, which was the first year of Nixon's presidency. And we focus very specifically, like a laser, on what he was doing vis-a-vis the war in Vietnam, the US involvement in Vietnam. So I'm sure we'd be happy to talk about other aspects of his presidency, but that's what our film is really about. What Nixon was saying publicly, and then what he was doing with his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, secretly in planning a major escalation of the war in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm. Okay, of course. It'll be good to hear from both of you. What do you believe Nixon's legacy overall is?
Well, if you want to talk overall, I'd say mixed. He definitely did some things that would in these days be considered progressive, such as in the environment. He helped to start the Environmental Protection Agency. And there were, there's other things like that. But I think in terms of foreign policy, it's hard, for me at least, to see too much positive. It seems like he helped to perpetuate the Cold War, and particularly in Vietnam, but also in other places. And I think it was sort of an extension of the kind of anti-communist mania that gripped the U.S. ever since the end of World War II. And he didn't do anything really significant to change it, with the exception, of what happened, in terms of his opening up the relationship between the U.S. and China. And that certainly was, one glimmer of hope, or one thing that was different from what he'd done pretty much everywhere else in the world. But we could talk about, other places where his legacy is not so good, besides Vietnam, most notably Chile, where that was definitely something where he helped to overthrow a democratically elected government, basically, with the same kind of Cold War mentality of anti-communism. You're going to add something, Steve?
A lot of people these days, you hear a lot of talk in the United States, given how crazy and disturbing Trump has been, looking back at the Republican Party of the past and saying, wow, Richard Nixon, he looks pretty good now compared to Trump. And yet, I would completely agree with what Robert has just said. Nixon's legacy is mixed at best. And I think much of his foreign policy, especially his policy toward Vietnam, toward Cambodia, toward Chile, its other places in the world, was awful.
Mm-hmm. And I'm guessing you would apply the same answer when it comes to Secretary Kissinger.
Yes, I would, most definitely, because Kissinger was very attached to Nixon. They were, as aides to Kissinger say in our film, foreign policy in the United States during the Nixon administration was really run by two people, Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. They sidelined the State Department, they sidelined the CIA. They really ran foreign policy as twins. So they had their disagreements. Personally, they had problems with each other. Nixon, we now know, was very anti-Semitic and treated Kissinger often in a very belittling and terrible way. But the two of them were, they thought, bound for glory together, and they were going to remake the world as best they could together.
Yeah, it is true based on the tapes that Nixon recorded during his meetings, as well as subsequent testimonies of other people in the White House staff when Nixon was president, that Kissinger act as if he was a sort of court Jewish figure in the Nixon kingdom, so to speak.
Yes, I think that's true. And he was, he was treated very badly in many ways. And he swallowed it. He put up with it, Kissinger, because I would say he lusted after power, and he finally had it with Nixon. And so he was not going to give it up, despite the personal abuse that he went through.
But it also is also true that Kissinger privately said many, many nasty things about Nixon behind his back, so that it was not, I mean, so that it was clearly not just Nixon belittling Kissinger, but the other way around as well. So, but that's personal. I mean, I think politically they were joined at the hip, and they really did agree in, with what they were trying to do in terms of basic foreign policy objectives.
So the 27th of January just passed, and it means a great deal to me as a Vietnamese, because that was the day when the Paris Peace Accords were signed. Of course, it was also the Holocaust Remembrance Day, so that day takes precedence, I suppose. But was 1973 a fitting year to end the war, or at least to end American involvement in the war, or do you believe that that date should have been earlier?
Well, I think the date should have been earlier, and that's one of the points we try to make in our film, The Movement, The Madman, which I will add, incidentally, anyone can watch internationally on Amazon Prime, and in the United States, they can watch it on PBS Passport or Canopy, which is the library streaming services. So I hope people do get a chance to actually watch our film, which debuted on public television in America last year on the series American Experience. But yes, our film makes the point that really, and again, this is coming not only from anti-war people, but people who worked for Kissinger as his aides, saying that really the war, a negotiated settlement to the war, could have taken place in Nixon's first year in office. And I think one of the awful things is that he prolongs the war. He ends up prolonging, he and Kissinger, so that it ends in a sense in 1973, and that was an important moment. But the war, as you know, went on till 1975. So many Vietnamese and other people in Southeast Asia, military and civilians, and many Americans in the military, I think, died unnecessarily because Nixon and Kissinger prolonged the war, a war that they could have ended in a negotiated settlement with much the same peace terms as they finally agreed to in January 1973.
Well, I mean, the other answer to your question is that the U.S. had no business getting involved to begin with. I mean, essentially, the U.S. continued they basically took the place of the French who'd colonized Vietnam. And there was really, one of the things the Pentagon Papers really showed is that it was only through a lot of lies and misrepresentations and, basically various, provocations and so on that the U.S. got involved to begin with. I mean, there was no real good reason aside from what I referred to earlier as kind of anti-communist hysteria, to continue it. So I'm not sure, it's not, I mean, what Steve said is correct, and I agree with it. But I mean, if you take a step or two back, we shouldn't have been there. We meaning the United States. I mean, the French got out after Dien Bien Phu, and there was no reason, for us to take their place. There was, I mean, the reason given, and the people like Nixon and Kissinger and LBJ before them, they wanted to have an anti-communist government in South Vietnam. And they admitted, I mean, the US admitted that in 1956, had the elections gone through that were, there was a Geneva Accords that mandated elections, and the U.S. said, that Ho Chi Minh would have won. So it was essentially an anti-democratic crusade that the U.S. Pursued in Vietnam. So it's really a very, it just wasn't true at all that any of the justifications for the war in terms of bringing democracy or peace and freedom to Vietnam was not really what was going on. So
Understood.
that's my.
Now, for my money, I believe that Nixon was not trying to win the war, so to speak. He was certainly trying to end it, but either by hook or by crook. Again, as I watched the documentary, I see that both Nixon and Kissinger were using intimidation tactics to force the North Vietnamese into submission. Now, I also wonder whether the North Vietnamese believed them.
That's a good question, and we don't know the answer to that. It would be very interesting to pursue that and find out. They clearly were not intimidated. We know that from the way they responded. And again, hearing from Kissinger's own aides who talked about what was going on with us, they say from their contacts with the North Vietnamese and from the history of North Vietnamese and National Liberation Front resistance in the South, that they were never going to give in, that they were determined to have a unified Vietnam, an independent Vietnam, and a Vietnam under their control. And that the United States, nothing the United States could have done short of some totally apocalyptic obliteration of the country was going to stop them. By the time Nixon came to office, he and especially Kissinger realized that the war could not be won, that the United States was not going to win the war. So you're right, he wanted to get out. Now, his defense secretary, Melvin Laird, who was a very conservative man, but had been in Congress and took the political temperature of Congress and the American people, he was a big advocate for withdrawing troops, US troops, as fast as possible. Nixon and Kissinger's initial strategy, as you saw in our film, was to reject that. They began very small troop withdrawals, finally, under great pressure from the anti-war movement and Americans in general. But they also had this secret plan, which Nixon himself nicknamed his Madman strategy. And that strategy, as you saw, was to threaten North Vietnam and their Russian allies with a major escalation of the war starting, they gave a deadline, November 1st, 1969, and that they would start this escalation unless North Vietnam capitulated and accepted Nixon's terms for ending the war, which they were not going to do. And those threats were very widespread and laid out in planning documents that we show in the film, documents that have now been declassified, that show that they were threatening to resume the bombing of the North, that they were threatening to bomb the dikes in North Vietnam to cause flooding and famine, that they were going to bomb cities, that they were going to mine Haiphong Harbor, that they were considering a ground invasion of the North, and they were threatening the use of tactical nuclear weapons, which is hard for many people to believe. Whether they would have done it is another issue, but they were threatening it over and over and over again in secret talks with the Russians and with the North Vietnamese.
And I would actually take issue with one of the statements you made. Was you said that he was not trying to win the war. I think that is precisely what he was trying to do. And by win the war, I mean that he was trying to have the government, that had a number of different faces, from the Chims to the, to Chu and Ki,
The South Vietnamese.
have them in power, to keep them in power. That was the goal. Those were the terms that he wanted them to accede to, meaning the North Vietnamese. And that's precisely why he was making these threats, that he wanted them to agree to a situation that would allow them to stay in power. It was, he wasn't trying to end the war by, these threats were in order to get his ends happening.
No, absolutely, Robert. I agree. What I'm saying is they knew militarily they couldn't win. It's like McNamara and Johnson before them. They knew it was impossible to win an all-out military victory, say like World War II. So, but they were trying absolutely to preserve as long as they possibly could a compliant government in Saigon. Absolutely.
And that precisely was why the negotiations in Paris that did, actually, ultimately lead to the agreement in 1973. But the big sticking point was, that the South Viet, the U.S., by the time of 73, particularly after the election, they were waiting for what Nixon and Kissinger called a decent interval. In other words, they assumed that the U.S. that the U.S. effort and the South Vietnamese effort would lose, but they wanted a decent interval after the U.S. withdrew before it collapsed. And so it took 2 years to collapse. But, I frankly think it was just an extraordinarily cynical way of trying to end the war. I mean, essentially, it's not going to, it's not going to end the way you want it, but you sort of let all these people get killed in between. There were hundreds of thousands of people that died after they decided they were going to jettison Thieu.
Yes. I believe that after 1969, what Nixon was trying to do is what we call Vietnamize the war, as in he wished to continue the war, but with as little involvement of ground troops as possible. He was trying to rectify what Johnson has done. And part of that is to focus the war effort on, the North and the South Vietnamese against each other. And he and, of course, Kissinger was trying to expand the war onto the rest of the former Indochina region, reaching to Cambodia. And of course, this is the part that remains controversial, that your documentary, I think, did not address, and that being the secret bombing campaign. So tell us more about that.
Right. First of all, as again, I say, we had a big decision when we started to make this film, which is, the issue, the story of the Vietnam War, of the Civil War itself in Vietnam, of French colonialism before, of why the United States got involved, and the long history of that war, and the history of the movement to stop that war in the United States and elsewhere in the world, the anti-war movement. That's a very long tale to tell. And Robert and I had a lot of discussions early on about what we could really take on what we could afford to make as a film, because filmmaking is quite expensive. And we decided that we would focus on this 1 year and this one epic showdown, really, between the anti-war movement, which did not know what Nixon was planning with Kissinger, this madman escalation, that we would focus on that, and that was still a widely unknown story, a bit of hidden history, and that it would be important to reveal that and talk about that by interviewing people on both sides, people who were in the White House doing this planning and people who were out in the streets protesting. So that's what we focused on. So we couldn't possibly, in 82 minutes of screen time, deal with the whole war. That would require a long series. Now, in that series, you would absolutely talk about the secret bombing of Laos, the secret bombing of Cambodia, which actually began in the spring of 1969 under Kissinger and Nixon. That was a moment we had to leave out for time in our film. But that was the beginning of their so-called Madman strategy, is they began secret bombing of Cambodia, the border areas, in the spring of '69. And that was their first step in this Madman strategy. They thought it would convey a message to the North Vietnamese: look, we're going to do things that Johnson didn't do. We're going to expand this war. We're going to take risks, and we're going to resume this bombing. So if you don't want to be bombed, you better agree to our terms. So that was part of their threat, was that initial bombing of Cambodia, which over the years only got worse and worse and worse, and ultimately, I think, caused a complete breakdown of that society and led to the rise of the horrible Khmer Rouge.
I could also say one of the other impetuses for our film was there was a film or a documentary series that Ken Burns did about Vietnam. And unlike our budget, which was considerably limited, they had, Bank of America and other resources of, as I recall, about $30 million to produce this 18-hour series on Vietnam. And one of the things that was deeply disturbing to us was the portrayal, or I should almost say lack of portrayal, of the anti-war movement. And so what we were very focused on was to try to tell a story that wasn't, that was sympathetic, of course, to the anti-war movement, but actually told a real story of its the power and impact of it. So that's what, that was left out completely in the caricatured version of the anti-war movement that was in this 18-hour extravaganza.
So, so in your view, why did the North Vietnamese win the war, or how did it win the war? I guess I have my own set of explanations for it, in that we have better tactics and we have better morale. The morale in the U.S. Army at that time was very low, and political support was scant. And the conventional tactics of the Army of the U.S. and also the Army of the Republic, the ARVN, was not prepared for the guerrilla tactics of the NVA. So those are my reasons. I'd like to hear yours.
Well, just on the tactical, strategic level, the North Vietnamese were quite brilliant about guerrilla war. And that goes way back to resisting Japanese occupation of Vietnam during World War II, when incidentally the United States, the OSS, the predecessor of the CIA, supported Ho Chi Minh's guerrillas because they were fighting against the Viet Minh, were fighting against the Japanese occupation. And of course, as Robert mentioned before, the successful anti-colonial fight against the French, culminating in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, where the outpost of French soldiers in the mountains, their generals, their commanders, couldn't imagine that the North Vietnamese would be able to come anywhere near them and defeat them. There was the famous book by Bernard Fall, Hell in a Very Small Place. But they were very successful in their guerrilla tactics, taking apart artillery and carrying it on their backs up the mountain. Incidentally, at that time, the United States offered France nuclear weapons to drop to try to protect their troops and win the day at Dien Bien Phu. And the French quite wisely said, "You're nuts, you're out of your mind, dropping nuclear weapons in that battle, it'll harm our own soldiers, it's ridiculous, cause world turmoil, no, we're not going to do it." But that was, to my knowledge, the first time the United States ever was going to introduce nuclear weapons into the war in Vietnam.
I'd also say that that it's probably not it's sort of very much part of the story rather than the full story to just talk about military tactics as the reason why one side won rather than the other. I mean, I think politically, it was always an extremely uphill battle to maintain the South Vietnamese government because it was deeply unpopular. Certainly, even before the U.S. Did its ground invasion, major ground invasion in 1965. I mean, the couple years before, the big Buddhist demonstrations, for instance, with the immolation of the Buddhists, that showed a very, great popular resistance. And just at no point did the South Vietnamese government get much political support. And the reason why in South Vietnam, without an air force, without the kind of armaments and so on that the United States had, was still able to succeed was because they were, they were fighting against something that was very much unpopular. And I think that's really the key, was the politics. Ultimately, it was only a matter of time before that government was going to go down.
That's really the key that Robert has said. And Tony Lake, one of the people we interviewed, who was an aide to Kissinger, later became the national security advisor to Bill Clinton when Clinton was president. He had, as a very young man, gone out to South Vietnam as a diplomat. He was based in central Vietnam, and he learned quite a bit about Vietnam. He was pretty well informed, and he saw the early fighting, and he reported back, and he told us in his interview that the key thing was that the North Vietnamese and their NLF allies in the South seized the role of being the anti-colonialist force. They were a patriotic force that was resisting foreign domination of Vietnam. And because that was what they could say, more than we're communists and we want a communist system in this country, that's why they had a deep and popular base. And ultimately, yes, that's why they were able to win.
Yes, and I should add also that the South Vietnamese regime was not democratic and certainly not popular. And after the overthrow of Diem, very unstable. There was a succession of coup d'états. I think Thieu was the first one, and this was followed by others leading up to the final one, Dong Văn Minh. So, and it is also noteworthy to say that Nixon's justifications, or his predecessor Johnson's justifications for continuing the war was never about protecting our ally in Southeast Asia, South Vietnam, from Northern domination. It was always about the spreading of communism towards uh, the entire region. So it kind of shows that to them, South Vietnam was kind of a lost cause.
Yeah, and I think that's you're pointing out a really good point, is that starting with Kennedy, the justification had to do with the domino effect. That if South Vietnamese goes, then Indonesia will go, and on and on and on. And after the Vietnamese War was, what we call the Vietnam War was over, no dominoes fell. It was a completely bogus argument from the get-go.
That's right. I grew up in Southern California in Los Angeles. And in those days, in the 50s and early 60s, it was a very conservative place, not like now. It was a very conservative place. And the mantra of the times was, if we don't stop them, the communists in Vietnam, then the domino effect, just like Robert said, is going to take place. And the next thing you know, we'll be fighting them we'll have to fight them in San Diego. So better to keep them at bay across the Pacific and stop it. That was the mantra. And, I think back, and to me, one of the many ultimate ironies of the war is the war comes to an end, and this big bloc that was, the Russians, the Chinese, and the North Vietnamese, what happens? In the late 70s, there's a border war between China and Vietnam, which have, as you know, I'm sure very well, the long, long history of contention. So that was the war, not the war in San Diego.
Of course, since you mentioned California, today it is home to at least a few generations of Vietnamese Americans who were refugees from the war. Of course, the first wave were Southerners, but successively, the refugees were people from the North, escaping the communist regime after 75. And of course, America at that time had zero or little reservations of letting them in, knowing that these people were from a communist regime.
Right.
Well, Robert can talk about some personal experience with that, but yes, I know and have friends with Vietnamese who have come to this country as refugees. And of course, most very anti-communist, and some with, very personal stories and good reason. But some have changed in this country too, and there's no uniform. It's not like the Cubans in Florida. The Vietnamese who came here have in many ways prospered, and in many ways become more politically diverse.
And the story Steve was alluding to, my personal story, is just that my son's in-laws were actually what's called boat people, who fled because, and when I've asked her parents why they left, and it partly was the fact that they were of Chinese background, Chinese, they'd lived in Vietnam for a generation, but, they felt discriminated against. And, frankly, they said there just wasn't opportunity, that the regime was not helpful to them. They were apolitical. They were not, they just tried to keep their heads down during the war. And, her father did not, was not a soldier, but, they were, they just didn't like the regime. And I don't think the point for most of the people, I mean, there were, many of the people in the anti-war movement were very, very sympathetic to the North Vietnamese. But I think that the overwhelming majority of the people in the anti-war movement, I'll speak for myself, was that we just didn't think the U.S. should be involved in that battle. We should not have been there. So it wasn't, love for the, Ho Chi Minh. It was really that we didn't think the US should be there. And that was what we kept saying, withdraw now. And as one of the people we interviewed, said that when he confronted a senator about, this is too complicated to do, and his response was, it's very simple, put them on planes and boats and point them east and tell them to leave. And, that's it. And I think that's what we were involved in. I think that, one of the, it is true that the North Vietnam was not a democratic regime. The current regime in Vietnam is not a democratic regime, but that isn't our business. Why should the US be a world's policeman again and again and again? I'm getting on a high horse here, but that is, that is really what the fundamental problem that has plagued the US and is definitely clear right now in the Middle East. The US is trying to play policeman, and picking who it likes and who is going to supply, who it's going to prop up. It's propping up the government in Israel right now. It's propping up, other regimes, and it's just something that is not in the best interests of the US. And I think that's the impulse that the anti-war movement had in the 60s and 70s, that many of the people that are out on the streets today and have been, at other times, such against the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, is that the US needs to pull back and actually focus on what's going on in this country, not trying to meddle in other countries.
Now, something that you showed in the documentary is that Nixon, who I certainly believe sees himself as a counter-revolutionary figure, he saw that, broadly speaking, everyone who supported the anti-war movement were, I guess, communists or left-wing radicals or subversives of any kind. But for me, there are plenty of people that you showed, and also people who have nothing but antipathy to communism. I'm thinking people like Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. or Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, or my personal hero, Thomas Merton, the Catholic monk. They have nothing to do with communism at all. And that yet all three of them, regardless of their religious backgrounds or political backgrounds, supported the anti-war movement. So tell me, how do you believe that this anti-war movement drew such a broad base of support?
Well, that's really, as Robert has mentioned, one of the absolute key points of our film, to try to present the anti-war movement as it was, not in any kind of stereotype. Look, the anti-war movement was very broad, and it definitely included leftists and people who were in support of North Vietnam and the NLF, absolutely. And it started in many ways with college students and with people who were afraid of being drafted. But the anti-war movement involved millions of Americans. It was very, very broad. In many ways, some of the biggest and most important demonstrations, including the ones we showed, were organized by people of faith, by religious people, by Martin Luther King's organization, the SCLC, his widow, Coretta Scott King, his key aide, Ralph Abernathy. Martin Luther King, of course, had come out against the war in a very, very important, famous sermon speech that he gave at Riverside Church in New York, that many condemned him for at the time. But it was a very, very important statement on King's part that the US should get out of Vietnam, that the war was awful for Vietnam and it was awful for the United States. The war was tearing this country apart. But as we show in the film, the anti-war movement, just take one example quickly, the moratorium on October 15th, 1969. The idea was to show how broad the anti-war movement really was and to have demonstrations take place on the same day in as many cities and towns and high schools and colleges as possible. and to show that it wasn't just on the two coasts of America, it wasn't just in the big cities, but that millions of Americans had turned against the war. And these are housewives, these are mothers for peace, these are trade unions. The biggest union that's much in the news now because they just endorsed Joe Biden for president, the United Auto Workers, was the first major union, really large auto union, to come out in support of withdrawal from Vietnam, of ending the war. So there were teachers, there were professionals, there were working people, black and white. It was, men and women. Should have been more women. Those times are kind of sexist in America in terms of leadership. But as we show in the film, the American anti-war movement was the largest protest movement of any kind in the history of the United States at that time.
I also think that, you put your finger on a very important issue when you talk about the religious support for the war. It was definitely support for the anti-war movement, I should say, that there was a very definite feeling that the war itself was immoral, that there was, what was the atrocities that were going on had no moral justification. Whether or not you believed in the just war theory or you were a pacifist, any way you look at it, it was very hard to justify as something that represented, the kind of values that Judaism, Islam, Christianity, that it just was so contrary to love thy neighbor. I mean, it just was something that could not be countenanced. And, and that's why religious leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. could not just look the other way. This was something that needed to be confronted, and that the kind of prophetic voice, that comes from the Judeo-Christian heritage had to be trumpeted.
Now, you touch on a very important point there, in regards to religion, because I I certainly remember in the days leading up to and during the Middle Eastern wars of the 2000s, when the U.S. got involved in Afghanistan and Iraq, there were a disturbing amount of rhetoric that kind of places that that reminds me of the crusade, so to speak. The Christian warriors are the Christian people are the people of peace, and the Islamic people are people of war, and that level of demagoguery and moral blindness, so to speak, is incredibly dangerous. But as with the as with the anti-war movement in regards to Vietnam as well as in Iraq, I find that a remarkable amount of American people, possibly the majority of the population, knows instinctively that uh, a war that its government or their government is getting involved into is either just or unjust. So, say there may have been protests at the Second World War, but most of us can agree that the Second World War was fought justly. But the same cannot be said when it comes to Vietnam and Iraq. So, in your view, what makes a war that particularly Americans are involved in a just war?
That's a big question. I mean, I would agree that as horrific as World War II was, and the bombings that took place at the end, absolutely horrific, was a just war, given Hitler and Japanese imperialism. But Vietnam, absolutely, immoral, a mistake, unjust, not necessary for the United States to have been involved in. The shock of 9/11 really traumatized America. And I think that unscrupulous leaders at the time took advantage of that and struck back in places that were off the wall to attack. I mean, the absolute worst was the invasion of Iraq on the basis that they had weapons of mass destruction, when by that time they certainly did not. So it was a lie to get into the war. I think the powers that be in the United States in control of our government at the time, wanted a war, wanted the United States to look powerful and show that we could be vindictive and we could crush opponents, even if they were the wrong opponents, just crush somebody. So don't get me started on the war in Iraq. It's just like absolutely, it was awful. And now people kind of admit it's awful, but it's in the past. So, war, I wish war didn't exist. I wish war didn't exist. I wish human beings were more highly evolved. They do. And so you have to approach each one on its merits, I guess. But you have to be very, very aware of the horrendous cost involved in any war.
Yeah, I'm not going to jump on the bandwagon about World War II or any war. I mean, World War II is a direct result of World War I. That you can't, well, anyway, that's a story that people know well, and that there's a tendency to start thinking about any kind of conflict at one particular point and sort of forget what led up to it. So that's, and I have to acknowledge that I'm a Quaker pacifist, and I, have a hard time justifying any war whatsoever. But, and I don't expect people to agree with me much on that point, though I'd be willing to argue it. But I do think that what we have to really look at is how wars are fought. And I don't think there's any justification whatsoever for the kind of bombing that the US and Britain did of German cities, in particular in World War II, nor the American bombing of Japanese cities, including Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That it was way beyond what was necessary for, even if you agreed with the goals of the war, that I just think that what's happened, and certainly we can see that at this point, armaments are so deadly, so powerful that, that once wars start, there's just almost no limit to how much destruction to civilians and the countries can happen. I mean, this is just, it's, we can see it right now, what's going on in Gaza, but we can also see it just at every war that's going on right now, just the potential for mass civilian destruction is just out of control. And so, it's very hard for me to see how you can justify, certainly the US getting involved in wars outside. And if the United States wants to defend itself, that's, let's talk about defending the United States, not how do we impose our will on other countries. And, but the United States has two big oceans that are pretty good at natural defense, and that isn't what's happening. So, I can't speak for, other countries and so on, but I just don't see any justification for us spending $1 trillion a year to, arm ourselves in order to be involved, with 800 bases all over the world. I mean, okay. I've gone on too long.
I'll tell you a thread quickly here that's amazing. The filmmaker Errol Morris made a film, Fog of War, where he interviewed Robert McNamara, who, as you know, ultimately came to express regrets for what he had conducted in the war with Lyndon Johnson in Vietnam. Well, Curtis LeMay was commander of the U.S. Air Force in World War II and a proponent of bombing, mass bombing, including civilian targets. And Robert McNamara studied under Curtis LeMay. Flash forward to 1968, and Curtis LeMay is running, bizarrely, as the vice presidential candidate on the George Wallace, the old racist segregationist George Wallace is running as a third-party candidate. And Curtis LeMay is publicly calling for the United States to drop the nuclear bomb on Vietnam. That's in his campaign. And as you may recall, our film starts with Nixon being asked a question about that. You know, Mr. Nixon, you're running for president. Curtis LeMay says he wants to drop a nuclear bomb on Vietnam. Would you ever do that? And Nixon says, oh, no, I'd never consider anything like that. That's absolutely unnecessary. That's wrong. And then, of course, secretly, that's exactly what Nixon begins to threaten to do as soon as he's president.
Now, I'd like to end on this note. I certainly believe that the anti-war demonstrations when it comes to Vietnam, I think to an extent Iraq too, shows the remarkable degree to which American democracy and its open society can manifest itself. Of course, there is certainly no anti-war movement in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. And I certainly doubt that in Iraq there was an anti-war movement in there too. And even though there are plenty of conflicts that are brewing around the world that the US may or may not have been involved in, the ones that get Americans concerned the most are the ones that, of course, Americans get themselves involved in, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, or Israel and Gaza. And it kind of shows the remarkable power in which the American public can have a say in whether a war continues or ends. So I suppose on that note, I'd like to hear your thoughts on how democracy, if I guess properly practiced, can do that, can stop the violence.
Well, thank you for noticing that about this country. And I agree with you. I mean, one of the things we have here is still, it's endangered, it's threatened. And this year is an absolutely crucial election focusing on this. But we have a democracy and we have freedom of speech and we have the right to protest. And we do. And Americans at their best are people who pride themselves in being able to speak out against injustice and to call their government when they feel their government is wrong. And that was what the anti-war movement did. In the case of Vietnam, it started very small and it grew and grew and grew. And it took a lot of dedicated organizers and leaders who are very important. But yes, there's something in our system at its best that is very positive. And that's something I'd like to see the United States export. Soft diplomacy, some culture, some democracy, some feelings of independence, asking questions, questioning authority.
I would just add, I very much agree with what Steve's saying, but I would say that with regard to foreign policy, it is very, very difficult for what the majority of American people want, for that to actually impact the people that are running foreign policy. In fact, it's been true, you know, for decades that that what the public wants is essentially ignored, and it takes a tremendous amount of energy. I mean, like right now, the overwhelming majority of people want to see a ceasefire in Israel, Gaza, but it's not that's not at all reflected in any of the main political actors on either side of the Republicans or Democrats. But the same thing was true in Vietnam, that it was very, very unpopular at the time that, what our film was talking about. And yet it took years of considerable effort and so on. And thankfully, we do have a system that ultimately we were able to succeed in getting it stopped. But it's we shouldn't just assume. I just think that that we just have to recognize that our system is, has some very good parts to it, but it's flawed. And that with regard to foreign policy, it's deeply flawed.
No.
But people can succeed.
Yeah, I'd still rather be protesting a war in the United States than protesting a war in Russia.
Or Israel.
But it was scary. It was scary, I will say, in the 60s too. There was a lot of repression of the anti-war movement. John Ehrlichman, who was the domestic advisor to Richard Nixon, one of his highest aides, he later famously said in an interview that we, the Nixon administration, had two enemies: Black people and the anti-war movement the left. And that's who we were up against, and that's who we were trying to control. And there was a lot of scary repression. We don't have time to go into that now, but it was important to push through that, not give up.
Now, I think I can end with something of a personal note. So my conceptions of the Vietnam War obviously experienced through history and through stories told by my parents, but also through American films, Apocalypse Now and Platoon and Full Metal Jacket. So it gives me, I guess, a multicolored view of the U.S. and the war. Of course, I come to realize that Americans are not evil people. And I also realize that the war is morally wrong. And it's something that really, really stuck with me. I realized that there are other things that Americans can bring to other corners of the world besides, I guess, bombs and weapons. One of them being Hollywood films and, of course, documentary films like yours. So, once again, I wish to thank you for your participation in the civil discourse of American democracy and for bringing this film to us, Robert and Stephen. And thank you again for joining the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.